The night had fallen in downtown Chicago, and the storm was relentless. The rain battered against the windows of the small diner where Ariana Harris worked, her uniform now soaked through from the late-night shift. She was used to the grind, the long hours, the exhausting days. But tonight, there was something heavier in the air. The storm outside seemed to reflect the weight of her life. Every raindrop on the window mirrored her struggle, never-ending, persistent, and cold. Ariana had been a waitress at the Rainy Day Diner for 2 years. The small establishment on the edge of the city had seen better days, but it was still her sanctuary in the midst of the chaos. She had always been a reliable one, never late, never asking for anything more than a paycheck to survive. But tonight, as the storm raged on, something was different. She could feel it in her bones. She had just finished cleaning a spilled coffee pot when she noticed a luxury sedan parked on the side of the road outside. The headlights blinked weakly, and the hazard lights flashed through the storm. Ariana hesitated for a moment. It was late, after 11 p.m., and the city's streets were empty. Yet, as she wiped the counter, her eyes lingered on the figure standing beside the car. An elderly man in a soaked suit looked around helplessly, his phone raised in one hand, probably searching for a signal. Ariana frowned. The last thing she wanted to do was get involved in something after her exhausting shift. But there was something about the man's posture, his vulnerability in the storm, that pulled her out of her own world. The storm had made everything seem distant, but this man needed help, and Ariana couldn't turn her back. With a deep sigh, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside, her boots sloshing through the wet pavement. The cold wind hit her face, stinging her skin, but she pushed through it. "Hey!" she called over the rain, walking closer to him. "Are you all right?" The man turned toward her, his face wet and tired. His gray hair stuck to his forehead, and his suit was drenched. He smiled weakly. "My car broke down, and I can't get a tow truck to pick up. I've been waiting out here for a while now." Ariana looked around. The road was empty, and the diner was the only light in sight. The storm was relentless, the streets empty except for them. She felt a flicker of hesitation. After all, the man was a stranger, and it wasn't exactly safe to stop for someone like this. But then she saw the exhaustion in his eyes and the way his hands trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper, a quiet resignation. "Get in," she said, unlocking the door to her old, beaten-up sedan. "You'll freeze out here." The man blinked, surprised at the sudden kindness, but after a moment of hesitation, he opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, dripping water onto the seat. Ariana turned on the heater, the warmth starting to fill the small car, and pulled away from the curb, heading into the unknown. As they drove through the storm, the man introduced himself. "I'm Henry Weston," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "I was just coming back from a meeting outside the city, and the storm caught me off guard." "Nice to meet you," Ariana said, glancing over at him. "You must be tired." He chuckled weakly. "You don't know the half of it. I've been out here too long already." The silence between them was comfortable. The hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of the rain on the roof filled the space. Ariana didn't ask him any more questions. She didn't need to. There was something about him that made her feel like she didn't have to pry. It wasn't often she met someone who wasn't constantly trying to make small talk or act like they didn't have their own problems. Henry seemed real. She drove him through her neighborhood, past the narrow apartment blocks, and under the flickering streetlights. The world outside seemed distant, muffled by the storm. When they reached her small one-room apartment, Ariana parked the car and handed him a towel. "You're welcome to crash here for the night," she said, gesturing to the couch. "The heater's weak, but at least it's warm." Henry looked at her for a moment, unsure, but then, with a small nod, he accepted. As he stepped inside, Ariana handed him a warm cup of instant soup, and they sat in silence for a while. He seemed to appreciate the quiet, and she did too. She had done something right tonight. Something simple, yet it felt like the world had shifted in that moment. Before he fell asleep on the couch, Henry wrote her a note and left it on the table. Ariana saw it after she left for work the next morning. "Thank you for seeing me as a person," it read. Ariana smiled faintly, folding the note into her pocket as she prepared for another long day at the diner. She didn't know yet that the man she had helped would walk back into her life the very next day, and everything would change. The rain had stopped by the time Ariana stepped through the back door of Rainy Day Diner. The sound of sizzling bacon and the rich aroma of coffee hit her as soon as she crossed the threshold. It was the same smell she had walked into every day for the past 2 years. The noise of the clattering dishes, the hum of the kitchen, and the soft chatter of customers. It was all familiar, comforting even. But today, everything felt heavier. The air in the diner seemed to be thicker than usual, and Ariana could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her chest as she made her way toward the kitchen. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:50 a.m. Her shift had started at 7 a.m., and though she had only been 10 minutes late, she already knew her manager, Steve Harlow, wouldn't let it slide. Ariana hurried into the kitchen, still damp from the storm, her damp hair falling messily over her forehead. She wiped her hands on her apron, trying to shake off the exhaustion of the previous night. Her mind kept drifting back to Henry Weston, the stranger she had helped. She'd given him a blanket, a warm cup of soup, and a place to sleep for the night, and he'd left her a note of gratitude. It wasn't much, but it was the kind of simple kindness she'd grown up believing in, the kind that felt good even if it didn't come with any grand gesture in return. She'd done the right thing. But Steve Harlow, the diner's manager, wasn't interested in right or wrong. He was interested in rules. And the rule was clear: be on time or face the consequences. Ariana. Steve's voice snapped her out of her thoughts as he appeared in the kitchen doorway. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his face flushed with irritation. "You think time bends for you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Ariana caught her breath, tried to steady herself. She'd worked here for over 2 years, and this was the first time she'd been even slightly late. She didn't deserve to be treated like this, but she knew how Steve was. His power trip was his way of dealing with his own insecurities. "I'm sorry, sir." The storm. Ariana started, but Steve wasn't having it. "Save it." He cut her off, slamming a receipt pad down on the counter, the force of it echoing in the otherwise quiet diner. His voice rose, loud enough for the few early morning customers at the counter to overhear. "We got a packed morning. The owner's coming by today. And you strolling like you're doing us a favor?" Ariana felt the heat rise in her chest, but she held her tongue. She knew she couldn't fight him now, not with the owner coming in today. This was the kind of power Steve wielded. He thrived on humiliating those who were beneath him, and Ariana knew she was never going to win by getting into a shouting match with him in front of customers. "I had to help someone," Ariana continued, her voice quiet and controlled. "An older man was stranded in the rain. I couldn't just leave him out there." But Steve wasn't interested in kindness or compassion. His face twisted with disdain. "You think good deeds pay the rent? You're late. That's all that matters. If any of you want to show up late, 2, maybe you can join her out the door." A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The young cook froze at the grill, the sound of sizzling bacon suddenly muted. The whole diner felt still, the tension in the air palpable. Ariana's heart raced, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. "Please, Mr. Harlow," Ariana said, her voice soft but firm. "I've worked here 4 years. You know I don't." Steve cut her off, his voice louder now, almost mocking. "I don't need excuses. I need reliability. You're done. Hand over your apron." Ariana's hands trembled as she reached behind her and slowly untied her apron. Every movement felt heavy, as though her very existence in this diner was being erased. She had always prided herself on being reliable, on showing up when others wouldn't. But in Steve's eyes, that didn't matter. The silence that followed was suffocating. The clattering of dishes, the hum of the fryers, even the customers' hushed murmurs, all of it faded away as Ariana laid her apron carefully on the counter, her eyes fixed on the fabric for a moment longer than she would have liked. "I'm sorry," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone in the room. As she turned toward the door, the bell above it jingled softly, announcing her exit. "That's perfect timing," Steve muttered, straightening his tie, a smirk spreading across his face. "Owner's finally coming today. Last thing I need is charity cases making the place look sloppy." Ariana didn't look back. She walked out into the drizzle, her heart heavy but her shoulders squared. The world outside felt colder now, the rain somehow sharper as it stung her face. She pulled her coat tighter around her, her thoughts consumed with the decision she had made the night before to help Henry. Had it been the right choice? Was it worth it? If this was the consequence she had to face? She stopped at the corner, her reflection barely visible in the puddle at her feet. She couldn't quite shake the sting of her manager's cruelty, but she had done the right thing. She was sure of it. What she didn't know yet was that the man she'd helped would walk back into her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. His next visit would rewrite both of their futures. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard the faint hum of a car engine approaching. She looked up and saw the black luxury sedan slowly rolling past the diner. The tinted window lowered just slightly, and she saw the familiar face of Henry Weston. He looked at her through the rain, his expression unreadable. Ariana didn't know it yet, but this moment would be the turning point in her life. Henry Weston wasn't just any man. He was about to change everything. Ariana arrived early the next morning, the sky still dark as the last remnants of the storm hung in the air. She stood at the diner's back door for a moment, tried to shake off the weight of the previous day. She hadn't expected to be fired. She hadn't expected the sting of it to cut this deep, but it did. She couldn't deny that. Her mind kept drifting back to Henry Weston, the old man she had helped the night before. It was strange how fate worked. She had simply offered him a ride and a warm place to stay, not expecting anything in return. And yet, she couldn't help but wonder if his presence in her life wasn't a sign of something more. She didn't know him, but he felt different, like he was more than just a stranger in the storm. He felt like a lifeline. As she stepped into the diner, the usual bustle greeted her. Steve Harlow, as always, was already behind the counter, barking orders at the staff. Ariana tried to ignore him as she made her way to the back to hang up her coat, but it was hard to ignore him when he was glaring at her as if she were the source of all his problems. He hadn't said a word to her since the day before, and the tension between them was thick. He didn't want her here, but she didn't care. She was used to fighting her own battles. She wasn't about to let Steve dictate her life any longer. Before she could gather her thoughts, the door to the diner swung open with a soft jingle. Ariana froze. There, standing in the doorway, was the man she least expected to see, Henry Weston. He stood tall, his silver hair neatly combed, wearing a sharp, dark tailor coat that stood out against the otherwise drab morning. His presence alone seemed to still the room. Every head in the diner turned in his direction, eyes wide with surprise. Ariana's stomach tightened as she watched him striding confidently, his gaze moving steadily across the room. He seemed completely at ease in the space, like he had been here 100 times. Steve, still at the counter, straightened up as if he were preparing to meet an important client. He plastered on a forced smile and rushed forward. "Mr. Weston," Steve said, his voice higher than usual, trying to mask his nerves. "Welcome, sir." Everything's running perfectly clean and efficient, just like you'd want it. We got a great crew here." Henry didn't acknowledge Steve's attempt at small talk. He only gave him a brief, cold look before his eyes scanned the diner more thoroughly. Ariana could feel the weight of his gaze as it swept over her, then quickly moved to the empty corner where her station had been. Ariana's heart skipped. She couldn't bring herself to look away, but she wasn't sure she wanted to meet his eyes. There was something about him, something about the way he carried himself, that made her feel exposed. Steve caught the look in Henry's eyes, and a small, almost imperceptible shift in his posture suggested a slight discomfort. He cleared his throat, then looked back at Henry. "We've had a few staffing issues, A lot of turnover lately. But everything's under control now." Henry's gaze didn't waver. He stood still, silent for a moment, before finally speaking, his voice calm but commanding. "Where's the young woman who worked here yesterday? The one who helped me?" Ariana's pulse raced. She felt her cheeks flush, her stomach sinking. He remembered me. Steve blinked, caught off guard. "You mean Ariana?" he said, as if the name left a bad taste in his mouth. "Well, she's not here anymore. I had to let her go this morning. Too many late arrivals, poor attitude, not the kind of image we want to project." He laughed, but it was hollow, forced. Henry's jaw tightened, and the room seemed to grow quieter. There was a moment of tense silence before he spoke again, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Is that so?" Steve tried to maintain control, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I run a tight ship. Reliability's everything. No room for exceptions." He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ariana watched Henry, unsure of what was going to happen next. She had no idea why he was here or what he was thinking. All she knew was that, for some reason, his presence felt like a turning point. Henry's eyes shifted to the cook, who had been watching the exchange carefully. The cook, a younger man named Kyle, shifted nervously but didn't speak. Henry didn't break his gaze. He leaned slightly toward Kyle. "Is what Mr. Harlow said true?" he asked, his tone almost clinical, as though the answer would determine everything. Kyle swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Steve and Henry. "No, sir. Ariana's the best waitress we've had. She's always on time, she's reliable, and she's got a great attitude. You can't replace someone like that." Ariana's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but a flicker of hope surged in her chest. Steve's face went pale. He didn't like being questioned, especially in front of the owner. "She broke the rules, Kyle. It's as simple as that." His voice was getting louder, but there was a tremor in it now. He could feel the ground slipping beneath him. Henry turned his focus back to Steve, and the weight of his gaze was enough to make Steve take a small step back. "You fired her for being late?" he asked, the words cutting through the air like a blade. Steve hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but—" "That's enough," Henry interrupted, his voice sharp now. "You'll call her back. Immediately." Steve blinked, his confusion evident. "Call her back? What do you mean?" "She's already gone." Henry didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Call her back. You fired her unjustly, and I'm going to make it right." The morning light poured into the diner's windows, casting a soft glow on the worn leather booths and polished chrome. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling eggs filled the air, but the atmosphere inside Rainy Day Diner felt different today. The usual hum of the kitchen was quieter, and the chatter of the customers seemed subdued, like the calm before a storm. Everyone was waiting for something, though none of them could have predicted what was about to unfold. Ariana stood behind the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. She was still trying to process what had happened earlier that morning. Henry Weston's arrival and his unexpected intervention. Steve Harlow had reluctantly called her back, though it was clear he didn't want to. The man who had once been her greatest source of frustration, the one who had belittled her for simply trying to do the right thing, was now forced to face the consequences of his actions. Henry had stepped into the diner like a man with a plan. He had seen through Steve's lies and called him out in front of the staff. Ariana couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude toward him. It was almost too surreal to believe that a man she helped on a rainy night had come back to help her, to give her a second chance. She hadn't expected anything in return when she'd taken him in, but now everything was changing. The course of her life was shifting before her eyes. The bell above the door jingled again, pulling Ariana from her thoughts. A tall man in a tailored suit stepped inside, his silver hair gleaming in the dim morning light. Ariana froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. It was Henry Weston. He walked through the door with purpose, his presence commanding the room. As usual, he was calm, collected, and somehow reassuring in his quiet authority. He was the man who would rewrite the story of this diner, and Ariana couldn't quite wrap her head around the fact that he was doing it for her. Henry's eyes scanned the room as he made his way toward the counter, his gaze settling on Ariana. He smiled softly, the kind of smile that felt both warm and reassuring. Ariana couldn't help but return the smile, though she was still unsure what was happening. Was this really her life? Was this how things were going to change? Ariana, Henry's voice cut through her thoughts, gentle but firm. I hope you're doing all right. Ariana nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. I'm fine, sir. Just still trying to process everything. It's a lot to take in. Henry leaned against the counter, his presence oddly calming. He studied her for a moment, his sharp gaze softening. You don't have to worry about Steve anymore, he said. I've already handled it. Her heart skipped a beat. Handled it? She asked, unsure what he meant. Henry's smile grew faint but purposeful. I've already had a conversation with Steve about the way he treated you. He'll be taking a step back. I've made it clear that this place will run differently from now on. No more fear. No more abuse. This is a place of respect. Ariana could hardly believe what she was hearing. Steve Harlow, the man who had humiliated her, who had treated her like nothing more than a pawn in his game, was being removed from the equation. It was almost too good to be true. But there was something in Henry's eyes that made her believe him. He was a man of his word, and his actions had already proven that. Before Ariana could respond, the door chimed again, and this time it wasn't just Henry who walked in. A uniformed officer followed him, the man's presence imposing but professional. Ariana's stomach flipped, and she instinctively took a step back, unsure of what was coming next. Henry didn't flinch. He turned toward the officer, nodding slightly. This is a police matter now, he said, his voice even. I'd like you to speak with Steve Harlow. Ariana watched, her heart racing, as the officer made his way toward the counter, where Steve stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock. Steve's face paled when he saw the officer approach him. For a moment, he seemed to lose all composure. Mr. Harlow, the officer said in a no-nonsense tone, I'm going to need you to come with me. The color drained from Steve's face as he stood there, utterly speechless. His jaw tightened, his fist clenched, but he didn't dare protest. The officer placed a firm hand on his shoulder, guiding him out of the diner without another word. As they exited, the staff stood silently, watching the scene unfold. Ariana's legs felt weak as she watched Steve being escorted out. For the first time in a long time, she felt relief. It wasn't just a sense of justice. It was something more profound. She had been through so much, and now everything was changing. It's over, Ariana whispered under her breath. It's really over. Henry turned to her, his expression softening. No, Ariana, he said, his tone gentle. This is just the beginning. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Ariana. With Steve gone, the atmosphere in the diner was lighter, more open. The staff seemed to move more smoothly, as though they were finally free from the oppressive weight that had been hanging over them. Even the customers seemed to notice the shift. The usual tension had disappeared, replaced by a quiet optimism. As Ariana worked through the day, she couldn't stop thinking about Henry and the strange twist of fate that had brought him into her life. She'd been so used to doing everything on her own, surviving by sheer willpower. But now, she realized that sometimes help came in unexpected forms. Just when she thought she had no more hope left, a stranger in the storm had stepped in to change her world. And now, that same man was offering her a future, one she never thought was possible. By the end of the shift, Ariana was no longer just a waitress at Rainy Day Diner. She was co-manager, a position Henry had appointed her to as a gesture of respect for her kindness. He'd given her the chance to run the place alongside him, his partner in the diner's transformation. As Ariana stood by the counter, watching the sunset through the diner's window, she realized just how much had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had walked in that morning. She wasn't the same woman who had been humiliated by Steve the day before. She had been given a chance she was going to take. Henry Weston had given her a second chance, and this time she was going to make sure she didn't let it slip away. The diner was almost unrecognizable as Ariana walked through its doors that morning. Rainy Day Diner, once a place of tension and fear, now felt like a new beginning, a place full of possibility. The usual clatter of plates and clinking of glasses still filled the air, but today it was accompanied by something else. Laughter. The kind of laughter that hadn't been heard here in years. As Ariana stepped behind the counter, she took a deep breath, savoring the scent of freshly brewed coffee and crispy bacon. There was a sense of freshness in the air, a newness that made everything feel more alive. The staff seemed to move with purpose, the usual tension gone. There was no more fear of Steve Harlow's presence, no more undercurrent of dread that had once permeated every interaction. She turned to look at Henry, who was sitting in his usual corner booth, silently watching her. He had been a steady presence since his intervention the day before, offering subtle guidance without overstepping. Ariana was still getting used to the idea of co-managing with him. She had worked for so long in the shadows, trying to stay invisible and out of trouble, that it was hard to believe her life had transformed so quickly. Yet, despite the relief, a quiet nervousness lingered. She had always dreamed of being in charge, of making the decisions, of shaping the diner into something more than just a place to grab a quick meal. But now that it was a reality, the weight of it felt heavier than she had anticipated. Power wasn't something she had ever felt comfortable with, and now she wasn't sure if she was ready for the responsibility that came with it. "You all right?" Henry's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find him watching her with a knowing look in his eyes. His presence, calm and steady, grounded her in a way she couldn't explain. Ariana smiled faintly, adjusting the apron around her waist. "Yeah, just a little overwhelmed, I guess." She looked around the diner, her eyes landing on the staff as they worked together seamlessly. "I didn't expect things to change this quickly. It's like everything's moving faster than I can keep up with." Henry's lips twitched into a small smile. "That's the way it goes sometimes. You don't always have time to prepare for change. But when it comes, you have to take it or it passes you by." Ariana nodded, taking in his words. She wasn't sure she was ready for all of this, but she also knew that she couldn't turn back now. Henry had given her the keys to this new life, and she had to find a way to make it work. Not just for her, but for everyone who depended on the diner. The morning rush began shortly after Henry's quiet words, and Ariana dove into the rhythm of the day. She moved from station to station, making sure everything ran smoothly. As orders piled up and the buzz of customers filled the room, she found herself falling into a role with more ease than she expected. The staff was working well together, and there was a sense of cohesion that hadn't existed before. Still, there was a nagging doubt in her mind, a feeling that no matter how smoothly things seemed to be going, there was always something on the horizon, waiting to knock her off balance. She had worked hard to get here, but would she be able to keep this new life from unraveling? It was in the afternoon, when the diner had quieted down for a brief moment, that Ariana received a text message that would change everything. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, and when she pulled it out, she saw a message from an unfamiliar number. "Ariana, we need to talk." The message was short, but the implications were clear. Steve Harlow. She felt her stomach drop. After everything that had happened, she hadn't expected to hear from him again. The closure she had been hoping for, the feeling that Steve was out of her life for good, seemed to slip through her fingers as she stared at the screen. "Where is he?" "I'll take care of it." Henry's voice came from behind her, sensing the tension in the room. He had watched her face as she read the message and immediately knew what it meant. Ariana looked up at him, her mind racing. She had worked so hard to get rid of Steve, to distance herself from his influence. The idea of him coming back into the diner, after everything he had done, filled her with an uncontrollable rage. But she knew that confronting him head-on would be a mistake. "I'm not sure if it's a good idea," she said, her voice shaking slightly. She didn't want to be weak. She had already stood up for herself once, and she wouldn't let Steve push her around again. Henry met her gaze, his eyes serious but not unkind. "Ariana, if you let him back in here, it will only cause problems. You've already proven your worth. Don't let him take that from you again." She took a deep breath. Henry was right. She couldn't let Steve Harlow control her life anymore. Not now that she had a chance at something better. With Henry's support, Ariana made the decision. She was done letting people walk all over her. She was done hiding from her past. If Steve wanted to come back into the diner, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. She composed a quick reply to the text message. "I'm not interested in hearing what you have to say. You're not welcome here." Ariana hit send before she could second-guess herself. The day went on without incident. The lunch rush came and went, and the afternoon passed with Henry's quiet support guiding Ariana through the responsibilities of her new role. She found herself taking charge more than she ever had before, making decisions confidently and with newfound sense of purpose. By the time the evening shift rolled around, Ariana was beginning to feel like she was in control of her own destiny. She still had a lot to learn, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally where she was supposed to be. The diner was buzzing with energy, and the staff was working in harmony. But just as the evening was settling into its usual rhythm, the door opened with a sharp jingle. Ariana's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to look to know who had walked in. Steve Harlow. The bell above the door jingled, a sound that was familiar yet entirely unsettling now. Ariana's heart pounded in her chest as her eyes locked onto the figure that had just walked into the diner. Steve Harlow. His familiar presence, the arrogant stance, and the slight smirk that always accompanied him when he thought he was in control, sent a chill through Ariana. She hadn't seen him since the morning he'd fired her, and after everything that happened since. Henry Weston stepping in, the diner's transformation, and her new role as co-manager, she had hoped she'd never have to deal with him again. But here he was, standing in the doorway like nothing had changed. He was dressed in his usual crisp suit, a far cry from the greasy apron and stained uniform he had worn when he'd bossed her around. He looked like he owned the place, but Ariana knew better. He had no power here anymore, not with Henry Weston watching over everything, not with her standing in charge. The room seemed to freeze for a second as Steve scanned the diner. His eyes briefly met Henry's, who was sitting in his usual spot, silently observing the tension in the room. Henry's face remained unreadable, but Ariana could see the subtle shift in his posture. He was ready, should things go south. Ariana, Steve's voice cut through the silence, sharp and condescending. "I didn't expect to see you here, but I figured I'd give it a try anyway." Ariana's fingers tightened around the counter, her knuckles white. She forced herself to breathe, to steady the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Anger, fear, disgust, it all surged through her in a wave. She had worked so hard to get to this point, to put Steve's words and his actions behind her. But here he was, daring to walk back into her life like he hadn't humiliated her just days ago. "What do you want, Steve?" Ariana asked, her voice calm but carrying an edge that she hadn't known she was capable of. Steve's smirk didn't falter as he stepped closer to the counter. "What I want?" He paused for a moment, eyes flicking over to Henry, who hadn't moved. "I just came to check on my investment. You've done a pretty good job of keeping things together here. I'll admit that, but I'm still the one who built this place up." Ariana took a deep breath, her patience running thin. She had nothing to prove to him anymore, not after everything Henry had done for her, and not after she'd taken control of her own life. "You didn't build anything," she said, her tone low and firm. "You created a toxic environment. You humiliated me. You fired me for being 10 minutes late after I helped someone in need." Steve's smile faded slightly at the reminder, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're still bitter about that?" He shook his head, as if dismissing her pain. "Let's not pretend you didn't screw up. I had to let you go. This isn't a charity." Ariana stepped out from behind the counter, her feet moving steadily but with purpose. The diner seemed quieter now, the sounds of the kitchen fading into the background as everyone in the room shifted their focus. The staff, the customers, even Henry, they were all waiting for Ariana to respond, to take her stand. "I didn't screw up," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I did the right thing. I helped someone who needed it. I chose kindness. That's not something you can understand, Steve. But I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need your validation. I have my own, and I'm running this diner now." There was a long silence after her words, and for a moment, Steve seemed to shrink. The power dynamic that had always been in his favor, the one that had kept Ariana silent for so long, was slipping away. But Steve wasn't about to go down without a fight. He took a step closer, leaning over the counter to meet her eye to eye. "You think you've won?" His voice was a low growl now, no longer the smug, mocking tone he'd used before. "You're nothing without me. You'll see that soon enough." Before Ariana could respond, a soft voice interrupted, cutting through the tension. "That's enough, Steve." It was Henry. Henry stood up from his booth, his presence instantly commanding the room. He didn't need to raise his voice. His calm, controlled demeanor spoke volumes. Steve turned to face him, his expression darkening. "This diner isn't yours anymore, Steve." Henry's voice was firm, but not aggressive. He didn't need to shout to make his point. "Ariana's in charge now. You're no longer welcome here." The finality in Henry's words hit Steve like a slap. He opened his mouth as if protest, but the words caught in his throat. For a moment, he looked like he might try to argue, but he could see the resolve in Henry's eyes. There was no getting around this. Henry stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Steve. "I don't care who you think you are, or how long you've been in charge here. You tried to ruin someone's life, and now you'll have to live with that." Steve's face twisted in anger, but he knew when he was beaten. With a final glare at Ariana, he turned and stormed out of the diner, the door slamming shut behind him with a resounding clang. The diner was still. Everyone seemed to hold their breath as the sound of Steve's footsteps faded into the distance. As the door swung closed, Ariana felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but there was no sense of relief. Not yet. The battle had been won, but the war wasn't over. She still had to prove herself, still had to show that she could handle this responsibility. She had taken a step toward reclaiming her life, but there was still so much ahead. Henry walked toward her, a quiet smile on his face. "You handle that well, Ariana." Ariana gave him a small smile, but it was filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I handled it well, but I knew it had to be done." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You did the right thing. He had no business treating you the way he did. You're a lot stronger than you think." Ariana's heart swelled with gratitude. Henry Weston had given her the courage to stand up for herself, to take control of her life. He had shown her what it meant to lead with integrity and strength. "Thank you, Henry." She whispered the words, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. With Steve gone and Ariana's leadership solidified, the day progressed with a new sense of purpose in the diner. The staff, for the first time in a long while, worked together without fear of reprimand. Ariana was no longer just a waitress. She was the leader of Rainy Day Diner. But the battle wasn't over. Steve Harlow was out, but the damage he caused couldn't be erased overnight. There were still changes to be made, and Ariana was ready to face them, whatever they might be. And as the sunset cast a golden glow over the diner, Ariana knew she wasn't walking alone anymore. She had a new family now, a family built on respect, trust, and the belief that kindness could change everything. The following weeks were a blur for Ariana. It felt like the entire city was watching, waiting to see how the Rainy Day Diner would fare under new management. The diner, once a place of strife and hidden tensions, had been reborn in the aftermath of Steve Harlow's departure. Customers seemed to return in droves, curious about the shift in atmosphere and the sudden surge of positivity that filled the space. Ariana had expected business, as usual, to come with some adjustment, but nothing could prepare her for the weight of real responsibility. Every morning, she arrived early, her heart racing with the anticipation of what lay ahead. The pressure of her new role was heavier than she had anticipated. She wasn't just managing the staff now. She was rebuilding trust with the employees, creating a work environment where people felt safe, valued, and heard. She was fixing what Steve had broken, and that was a monumental task. Despite the challenges, Ariana found herself rising to the occasion. Each morning, she would meet with the staff, listen to their concerns, and make adjustments where necessary. She made it clear that things were different now. There was no room for fear or tension. The diner would be a place of respect, collaboration, and hard work. And slowly, the team began to rally around her, sensing her commitment to their well-being. But the weight of running the diner wasn't the only challenge Ariana faced. There was still the lingering feeling that something was missing, a sense of unease that had settled into the pit of her stomach. Even with all the changes, she couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking just beneath the surface. She hadn't heard from Steve since that fateful day, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that he would come back, ready to destroy everything she had built. It was a Thursday afternoon when the next wave of change hit. Ariana was in the back office, sifting through paperwork when the doorbell chimed, signaling a new customer. The quiet chatter of the diner continued as Ariana tried to finish up a few things before the dinner rush hit. But then she heard it. The sound of heels clicking sharply on the diner's floor, followed by a voice that made her blood run cold. "Ariana Harris?" Ariana's head snapped up. Standing in the doorway was a woman in a sleek, professional suit. Her blonde hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, and her demeanor was all business. She held a clipboard, her expression unreadable. "Yes," Ariana responded, her voice steady, but her nerves were immediately on edge. The woman smiled coldly. "My name is Rachel Mays. I'm with the corporate office for Franklin's Diner Corporation." Ariana's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. Not now. Her thoughts raced, but she managed to keep her expression neutral. "How can I help you?" Ariana asked, trying to keep the rising panic in her chest under control. Rachel's smile never wavered, but there was something in her eyes that made Ariana feel like she was being scrutinized under a microscope. "I've been sent here to inspect the diner. There have been complaints about its performance since the change in management. Corporate isn't happy about it." Ariana felt her stomach tighten. "Complaints?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've been doing just fine. Business is up. Customers are happy." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "The diner's numbers aren't reflecting that. There's been a sharp decline in profits over the last few weeks. Corporate wants to make sure you're following the proper procedures." Ariana's mind was racing. She knew the diner was still adjusting, but the last thing she expected was for corporate to send someone to dig through the operation. Everything was in place. Things were running smoothly, weren't they? "I assure you, we're following all procedures," Ariana replied, standing up from her chair. "We've made some changes, yes, but everything is in order. The staff is happy, and so are the customers." Rachel didn't seem convinced. She stepped further into the diner, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. "I'll be conducting a full inspection," she said, her tone flat and clinical. "I'll need access to the books, the financial reports, and your employee records." Ariana swallowed hard. The last thing she wanted was for corporate to get involved. She had been trying to distance herself from Steve's legacy, and now it seemed like the shadow of his influence was still looming over the diner. Corporate intervention could mean a change in leadership, a change Ariana wasn't sure she was ready to fight. "I'll get you the reports," Ariana said, trying to keep her composure. "But if you have any concerns, I can assure you we're doing everything by the book." Rachel didn't respond, only nodding curtly. "I'll be here for the next few hours. I'll need everything by then." As Rachel moved to the back office, Ariana felt a familiar weight of uncertainty pressed down on her again. She wasn't sure what she was walking into, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let them take this from her. The afternoon dragged on, with Ariana making sure everything was in order for Rachel's inspection. She gave her staff a quick pep talk, telling them to stay calm and keep doing their best. They'd been through a lot together already, and they had a lot of faith in Ariana. But as the sun began to set, she couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel's inspection was just the beginning of another battle. And this time, Ariana wasn't sure she had the strength to fight it alone. That evening, as the last customer left and the lights dimmed, Ariana sat in the back office, her mind racing. Rachel had left, but the weight of her presence lingered. The inspection wasn't over, and Ariana still had no idea what the future held. She glanced at the phone on her desk. It was a message from Henry. "We'll talk tomorrow. I've got your back, Ariana. We'll figure this out." Ariana felt a sense of comfort at his words. She wasn't alone, and with Henry by her side, she could face whatever came next. The world outside was dark, but inside the diner, a light had started to shine. Ariana wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the diner, for the team, and for a future where she could finally be free from the shadows of her past.